Victor Heiser, the 16-year-old son of a Johnstown, Pennsylvania merchant, traversed the knee-deep water between his house and barn. It was just after 4 p.m. on May 31, 1889, and his father had instructed him to untie the horses so they wouldn't drown if the water rose higher. When Victor started back for the house, he caught sight of his parents in a second-story window, frantically motioning for him to turn back to the barn. In 1889, Johnstown was a growing industrial city with a population of approximately 30,000, up from 15,000 a decade earlier. Workers, many of them recent immigrants from Eastern Europe, arrived in droves to toil at the town's steel and barbed wire factories. 5-story office buildings had sprung up on Main Street in recent years, and the city had a night school, an opera house, and a library. By all accounts, Johnstown was keeping pace as industry revolutionized America's landscape and workforce. Nested at the confluence of 2 rivers in the narrow Conemaugh Valley, however, Johnstown had been prone to flooding since its inception early in the 19th century. The exclusive South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club resort stood high above Johnstown in the Allegheny Mountains. Just 80 miles from Pittsburgh, the pristine mountain environment provided a welcome respite from city life for its 60 wealthy members, including industrialists Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick. The resort maintained a private reservoir known as Lake Conemaugh, which contained 20 million tons of water corralled by the South Fork Dam, and thousands of fish trucked in for the pleasure of the resort's casual anglers. The resort installed fish screens in the dam's spillway to keep the fish in the reservoir, but maintained the dam poorly, so the screens were frequently jammed with debris. While questions about the dam's efficacy arose through the 1880s, the dam held strong season after season. On May 30th, a torrential rainstorm roared into Johnstown. Creeks swelled, lakes rose, and rail lines washed out. By the morning of May 31st, a few feet of water gushed through town, but the minor flooding did not concern the residents. They dutifully moved their valuables to upper floors, preparing to wait out the high waters. Very few headed for high ground, though the foothills were only a stone's throw from their front doors. Meanwhile, the club's officials sent a team of workers to unclog the spillway. Twice that morning, the officials sent telegrams down to Johnstown, warning that the dam could give way. But they had cried wolf so many times that their messages went unheeded. The dam broke at approximately 3 p.m., releasing 20 million tons of water that flattened the tiny town of South Fork within minutes, transforming its 24 houses into a churning mass of debris. The flood rolled toward the unsuspecting town below, tearing through the steel and barbed wire factories and collecting what would prove to be some of its most lethal debris. The flood slammed into Johnstown a little after 4 p.m., traveling at an estimated speed of 40 miles per hour and reaching a height of 60 feet. Houses, trees, and livestock, minutes earlier the benign fixtures of Johnstown's quiet streets, whirled and reared in the floodwaters. The current swept away the barn, leaving Victor Heiser fighting furiously to stay atop the roof. He careened through the wreckage at a nightmarish pace, gaping helplessly as friends and neighbors swirled in and out of sight, their situations as dire as his own. Victor caught only glimpses of his unfortunate companions as he jumped and rolled, dodging the wreckage as it surged and slammed from every direction. Victor's raft finally sailed out to comparatively open water. At long last, as Victor passed a house still on its foundations, he was able to jump onto its roof and join a group of similarly soaked and shaken townspeople. As darkness fell, they heard other houses succumb to the floodwater's pressure, their walls and roofs slipping into the quagmire as their foundations gave way. Hours after the debris lodged at the stone bridge, 80 people remained trapped in the ruins. As the waters receded, gas and hot coals transformed the wreckage into a funeral pyre. Citizens who had narrowly escaped drowning now burned to death. In all, 2,209 people died in the flood, including 396 children. At the time, the Johnstown flood was the largest loss of civilian life the United States had ever seen. The death toll would later be surpassed by the Galveston hurricane of 1900 and by the attacks of September 11, 2001. The relief efforts began as news of the flood reached Pittsburgh, then Philadelphia, New York, and the rest of the world. Rail lines had been washed away, but laborers worked day and night to restore them. Before long, trainloads of food, clothing, and tents made their way to survivors. Among the most prominent relief workers was Clara Barton, then 67 years old, who aided survivors for 5 full months. The flood was the first disaster to which her organization, the American Red Cross, had responded. When the sun rose on June 1, 1889, Victor Heiser still huddled with his fellow survivors. The house had stood through the night, and now in the light of day, the group could see that the water had receded some. With their eyes on the hills a half a mile away, they scaled mounds of wreckage and waded through filthy pools. Once on high ground, Victor set out to find his parents, despite the slim odds of their survival. For 2 weeks, he scoured the wreckage and frequented the makeshift morgues set up around town. He found his mother's body at last, and laid her to rest in the family plot. Atop a pile of wreckage, he also found a large chest that had stood in his parents' house. Inside and intact were his father's Civil War uniform, a collection of silver, his mother's Bible, and a single penny. His father, whose anxious hand motions had directed Victor to the top of the barn and saved his life, was never found. So hungry were Americans for breaking news that newspapers around the country strained their presses to put out extra editions. Stories of the disaster, often true, sometimes exaggerated, at times patently false, traveled almost as quickly as the floodwaters had. But soon, with the waters abated and cleanup well underway, the newspapers turned from human interest stories to the question of whether the members of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club could be held responsible for the flood. Their accusers argued that the tragedy might have been averted with more careful maintenance of the dam, because no individual club member could be singled out as negligent, and because an act of God, the powerful rainstorm, had placed unforeseen pressure on the dam. The club members were never held legally responsible for the disaster. Partially as a result of the flood, however, in the 1890s, many states adopted a law that held owners liable for the unnatural use of land. This law would later help usher in strict liability, a prominent feature of our legal system today. Americans maintained their fascination with the flood for many years. Poems and song lyrics described mothers clutching their babes to their breasts as they sank beneath the waves. Amusement parks, including Coney Island and Chicago's White City, featured attractions that recreated the Johnstown flood. A 1926 film entitled The Johnstown Flood depicted a romance interrupted by the dam's collapse. And a 1946 cartoon, also called The Johnstown Flood, showed the dam bursting and the flood waters descending, only to be reversed at the last minute by that heroic rodent, Mighty Mouse. Victor Heiser spent several weeks helping to clear corpses and debris. But with the loss of his family home, his father's business, and his parents themselves, the 16-year-old had few ties left to the city. He set out into the world and eventually enrolled in medical school. As a doctor, Victor developed the first effective treatment for leprosy and is credited with saving more than 2 million lives. In 1968, the historian David McCullough published his first book, The Johnstown Flood, a remarkable telling of the events of May 31, 1889. Years later, playwright Rebecca Gilman read McCullough's book and toyed with the idea of writing a play about the flood. In 2005, when Hurricane Katrina ravaged New Orleans, the parallels between the two disasters gave Gilman the impetus she needed to begin writing.